Danny Kozak stepped out of line, and danger wasn't far behind. But before you can hear that story, you need to know about Alex Grace at Midlands Television Studios. Mr. Grace was the proud host of Midlands After Dark with Alex Grace until tragedy struck on June 29, 2017. He had invited a special guest to make an appearance on the show, Elias the chimpanzee, with his handler, Danny Kozak. Mr. Grace was thrilled to have such a unique guest on the show, and the studio was buzzing that afternoon to see the tricks that Elias the chimpanzee would perform. But onlookers at the set that day were treated to a much different show than planned. Because once Elias sat in the chair alone across from Mr. Grace, Elias started screaming. He started jumping up and down, and then he ran towards his trainer, Danny Kozak. But instead of seeking the safety of the defendant, Elias attacked, mauled, and killed Chris Villafana, a writer for Midlands After Dark. You will see today that the defendant had a duty of care to Midlands Television Studios. And he put Chris Villafana and others in danger by choosing to stand 20 feet away from Elias and positioning other people between them. Members of the jury, in today's case, we're the plaintiff as Midlands Television Studios, and we have a burden of proof. We have to prove two things to you by a preponderance of the evidence, meaning that it's slightly more likely than not that these two things are true. The first is that Danny Kozak breached the duty of care he owed to Midlands Television Studios. And the second is that that breach in duty was the direct and proximate cause of Elias's attack that afternoon. To do this, we'll call 3 witnesses who will tell you the story of how Danny Kozak stepped out of line and danger wasn't far behind. First, you will hear from Hunter Cooper, who was on set that afternoon. He'll take the stand and testify to where the defendant was standing, over 15 feet away from Elias. He'll tell you also about a conversation he overheard between the defendant and Chris Villafana's spouse, in which the defendant admits that he never should have been standing that far away. Next, you'll hear from AJ McClellan, another celebrity star scheduled to appear on Midlands After Dark that night. She'll tell you how before the rehearsal even began, she overheard who she believed to be the defendant saying that Elias was grumpy and that he didn't particularly want Elias to calm down. She'll tell you what that rehearsal was like, how Danny Kozak stepped off the stage, walked 20 feet away, and positioned the writers of the show between himself and Elias. Finally, you'll hear from Alex Grace himself. He'll tell you about his show and how he made sure to follow all of the best industry safety standards for hosting a live animal guest. He'll tell you that he focused on these principles before and during the visit and brought in 5 experts to assess the safety of the set. You'll hear from him what it was like to sit across from Elias in that chair, and how Elias's view of Danny wasn't clear because of the dim lights. Members of the jury, Danny Kozak stepped out of line, and danger wasn't far behind. The evidence will show you today that when Danny Kozak stepped away from Elias and stood behind the writers of Midlands After Dark, he put them in danger, and he breached his duty of care. You will see that that breach is what led to the attack, and at the end of trial today, my co-counsel, Mr. Matt Bryson, will come before you and ask you to consider this. and he'll ask you to find Danny Kozak liable. Thank you.